we're not going to have a collapse of the food system. What you're going to have is just a really big increased cost. What we seem to see is a farm population that's expecting a technology solution.
It's almost like a silver bullet or something.
Yeah.
Welcome to another episode. We have the honor of speaking with Clay Mitchell, who is the co-founder and managing director of farmland Capital. He is not only a venture capitalist, but also a fifth-generation farmer. So brings all those insights into the investments and philosophies at farmland Capital, and also has had a focus on furthering the field of precision agriculture. So through our short conversations, I've seen glimpses into the depth in which you think about all of these things, and so I'm super excited to jump into this conversation today. We'll dive into it.
Thank you, Melody.
You come from a long line of farmers, fifth generation. So can you share some early memories from your family's farm in Iowa and how those experiences shaped your passion for agriculture?
Yes, this is a community that has, a lot of the neighbors have been on their farms for many generations as well. So there's this incredible feeling of stability, even though I grew up during a time of rapid technological changes. So there's a feeling of being dynamic as well. My parents' bedroom today is still the room that my dad was born in. And I live in a house that was built in the 1800s by a great-grandfather.
And did we mention this is Iowa?
And this is Iowa, yeah. That's right. And it was a really happy childhood. I loved growing up farming with my grandparents on both sides of the family, as well as my parents. The neighborhood, the school, the community church was all something that I grew up at a very early age of cherishing and wanting to preserve. And I also realized that a lot of the strength of the community came down to the soil that made that a productive farming community. And so there was really a desire to conserve and preserve things that I saw as being fragile that we depended on. And that has really been the core of a lot of the conservation work that we've continued to do to this day.
Then you went ahead and studied biomedical engineering at Harvard, and then was it agronomy at Cornell?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so how did these experiences lead you to then pursue studies?
I grew up doing a lot of technical work with my dad. My dad is an engineer as well as a farmer, and he worked in a John Deere foundry full-time in addition to farming full-time. And the days of the early PCs, we had one of the first computers, and my brother and I would be coding after school several hours a day.
Oh, wow.
When I was 3 and my brother was 4, I saw my parents build a 150-foot tall radio tower in my backyard. And my brother, he could read very well at that time, leaned over their shoulders as they were getting their ham radio licenses, and he picked it up. So they brought him in to get his license as well. I think to this day was the youngest person ever to get licensed.
Yeah.
And I saw him get a lot of attention for that. I'd just be crawling around in the background. This attraction to engineering came from the joy of working with my dad and building things, the joy of writing code and creating, and then also having seen this incredible attention that my brother got as well. That like out of all of these desirable things that were very internalized as well as what I had observed. So it was just very natural that I wanted to study engineering in college.
I feel like there's certain industries that end up pursuing and furthering like technology just naturally because of what you're trying to achieve in agriculture. Do you feel like you were seeing that where things like your parents building like radio, you said a radio tower in the backyard?
Yeah. Farming just happens to be a field where whatever technical skills a person has, if they're good at fabricating with metal, if they're good at electronics, if they're good at coding, there's opportunities for it. You've got a lot of mechanization, you've got huge flows of natural resources. Agriculture uses half of the Earth's land and 70% of fresh water. They're just huge resource flows.
Yeah.
And so it is like this huge engineering problem.
Yeah.
It's also something that's, especially in a place like I grew up in Iowa, done in beautiful surroundings. There's really an aesthetic to it. Iowa's also a place with these dramatic seasonal changes with very snowy winters when I was growing up, a little bit less so now, muddy springs, green summers, and these golden fall crisp harvests.
That sounds beautiful. And I feel like even just in the few farm visits that we've gone on, I've been able to encounter that a bit. You've been a pioneer in precision agriculture. So what motivated you to shift from those traditional farming techniques to pursue the sort of technology available to you?
In farming, like a lot of other industries, opportunity cost is important. So when you're looking at like, how do I want to solve a problem? The first step is prioritizing what matters most. I've got costs on my farm and I'm trying to produce a certain yield. If I'm working on the third or fourth or fifth most important thing before solving the first thing, then I'm not getting ahead. The first part of the kind of the technical journey is making a deep observation of what's going on in the field. That's really firsthand, a lot of measurements of plants and soil and a lot of different kind of measurements that take place over years, because the interactions that we're trying to observe and measure are things that may compound over years. That takes a lot of patience and discerning often very subtle things in the field. We would find that a lot of the way that seed and fertilizer chemicals are applied is just really inaccurate, and there are really large gains to be made by identifying where the inaccuracies were coming from and then improving those.
And so that became the focus and what drove you to dive into precision agriculture.
Yeah.
So I guess shifting gears a bit, what led you to co-found Fall Line Capital, and how did your background in all of this influence the vision and mission of the firm?
I loved the life that I was living on the farm. The scale wasn't expanding, and it wasn't something that I was looking to do primarily. It's a family farm. I'm doing most of the work myself and with my parents. It was a time where I'd see other farming enterprises grow. It's something that I wondered, should I put more focus on growth rather than the kind of fidelity that I was focused on, or do I do both? And a college friend who had spent his career in venture capital and had had quite a bit of success in that approached me and suggested that the combination of our backgrounds would be very compelling for a specialized firm that focuses on improving farmland and investing in technology as well. This was an unusual approach to combine these two asset classes.
Yeah.
And very different from a risk profile, but very synergistic from a management profile. That the people who I had met through my career, who I respected as the best thinkers in farm operations and engineering and agronomy, would build a great team for tackling this. And the firm's really come into existence very much as we imagined.
And could you expand on synergistic between the two asset classes?
Yeah, in the farmland, we'll identify what are yield limitations in certain regions that kind of historical technology has never been able to solve, that we can see there are new innovations that will help us break through those, and we can bring in the technology, we can invest in the technology and improve the farmland while also having equity in that technology.
Oh, in the technology.
In both sides.
Yes.
It's quite a range. We have bought and improved farms in Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And so these are some areas where we're in deserts, some places with 60 inches of rainfall, and rice and cotton to onions and potatoes, and permanent crops as well. So there will be a different focus in different areas, but it's the fundamental principles of agronomy and the fundamental approach is the same. And so we'll test new technologies on our farm, often before investing in startup companies, and then deploy the technologies on our farms that we invest in as well.
I'm curious, just really quickly on the timeline. It was Harvard, then Cornell, and then basically you went back to work on the Mitchell farm and worked on precision agriculture, that type of work. And then how long was that before you ended up?
Yeah, so I was farming full time from about 2000 to 2011 before starting Fall Line with Eric O'Brien. And we closed our first fund. That was late in the year, and closed our first fund in 2013. We've raised 4 funds and just kicking off for our 5th.
Yes. And in terms of thinking about what are you seeing out there right now that you're really excited about in terms of you're kicking off your next fund, what's out there on the horizon
Yeah, on the venture side, a lot of great robotics opportunities. In the California crops, it's really about labor, and there's a huge amount of hand labor in weeding and harvesting, and machine learning and computer vision really open up magnificent opportunities for continuing to automate these. These are often in fields where temperatures get so hot during the growing season that it's not healthy for a person to work continuously. And increasingly offering solutions that reduce that burden on labor is important. It's less about labor in our corn, soybeans, wheat, canola, the major commodity crops, where the labor is a small part of the overall resources brought to bear. A single person is using huge machinery to farm large area, and removing that person doesn't really achieve anything. In many cases, the way that people operate today is gathered by the farmer. If you remove them, it can be a step backwards, because you're not gathering all that information in some other way.
And there's context that the farmer has as their
Plus, we enjoy it. We want to be out there. We don't want to be further removed. But automation can make a huge difference in continuing to improve the accuracy with which everything is conducted in the field, the predictability of what we're doing in the field, the speed, and that's an area. There's a lot of biotech innovation. We've had a pretty major collapse in the way that weeds are controlled in the United States. That's the most universal problem in farming. Some places you've got fungal diseases, some places you don't. Some places you have insects, and some places you don't, as a problem. But weeds are universal, and it's the biggest cost in pest control. And from 1950 to mid-1980s, there were new modes of action that were released every few years. And because of the kind of sloppy application methods, I would venture to say every single time a farmer went into the field, they were creating selection pressures for resistant weeds. There'd be sublethal doses given on parts of the field and drifting into border areas and things like this, so that in 3 years of recurrent selection for most chemicals, you get resistance. And we haven't had a new mode of action since mid-1980s.
Wow.
So,
and this is because?
It's because of the cost of bringing something to market, because of regulatory reasons, and because increasing realization of the unintended consequences of a lot of synthetic chemistry that's been used in farming. So the bar has gone up, and it's just not been a lucrative thing to bring new modes of action to market. Then we had from the mid-1996 until around 2010, you had a pretty effective weed control, glyphosate-tolerant crops, Roundup-ready crops that Monsanto brought to the market, which was existing chemistry, but the crop was modified to be resistant to it. And that worked really well for a while, and then the same kind of poor applications led to resistance. Other old chemistry was stacked on top of Roundup. Growth regulator chemicals, 2,4-D and dicamba tolerance was bred into soybeans, and that still had some effectiveness within the crop. From 2016, this year, it's been fairly effective, but now where resistance is being reported as being pretty widespread this year. And the kind of resistance that's developed in weeds is, in many cases, metabolic resistance. In other words, it's not at the site at which the herbicide is acting, but it's the ability of the plant to break down the chemical that was applied to it. And that mechanism typically works across many classes. So that kind of resistance is be able to create a tolerance to, in many cases, herbicides that haven't even been created yet. And so that's where we stand today. And this is like a really historical change in farming. In 1950, you had 20% of the U.S. population was farming, and it's been 2% in recent years. That herbicide technology, more than anything else, is what enabled this reduction in labor in farming, more than mechanization, more than commercial fertilizers, more than hybrid crops. That's been the most important thing. It destroyed it. And so new technologies are needed, or different ways of farming. And really both. And there are a lot of things that can be done on the farming side. The way that crops are rotated makes a huge difference, and which is the foundation of organic farming. But also robotic weeding, which we've seen in the field a bit, is one of the solutions. And also really next generation biological kind of controls. Gene silencing with RNA, or interrupting key pathways with small peptides that are completely selective to the species that we're trying to control, are totally revolutionary. We are pursuing all of these. We're investing in these opportunities. So that's one key area.
And what would you say is the sort of like natural end, or the end of if we don't tackle this problem?
What we've seen is a 4 times increase in the cost of chemicals since kind of the Roundup Ready breakdown started to occur. And we're using a lot more. So what's happening today is that farmers are just blanketing fields with kind of every mode of action available, hoping that weeds which may be resistant to 3 or 4 or 5 chemicals maybe will be killed by the 6th one.
Yeah.
And it's driving up costs, it's driving up environmental impact, and actually accelerating further resistance.
Yeah.
We're not going to have a collapse of the food system. What you're going to have is just a really big increased cost. And that's through both lower yields, because you simply, even as you're adding in the cost, you're not getting to the level of control that we used to have. So you just got pressure. You got weed seed in the produce more often, in grains. It's more of an issue with storage and everything. So you just have this malaise that settles in over crop production.
Yeah.
In Iowa, we have almost all corn and soybeans, and less than a 1% change from year to year outside of that. And eventually farmers would need to rotate in winter cereals, alfalfa, other things that really break the weed cycle. If we look at what's happening today, that seems to be the last thing that farmers would go to. It's not happening.
Yeah.
What we seem to see is a farm population that's expecting a technology solution.
Which is almost like a silver bullet or something.
Yeah. Ideally, I would like to see both, where farmers are really getting back to a lot of good block and tackle, classic weed control, all the cultural methods that you use, how you use cover crops, how in some limited cases you use tillage or other things. But science is revealing great opportunities for technology to help this as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's bringing both to bear.
Both. So this is a great segue to, we're already here, we're zooming out and talking about the big picture. What is your long-term vision for a world in which both the people and planet are thriving, and how do you see Fall Line Capital's work fitting into that vision?
I think it very much goes back to the vision of the community that I grew up in. I grew up in a community where kind of everyone was an owner, it seemed. Farmers owned their farms, and storekeepers own their stores, and it was a very middle class kind of upbringing, whether somebody was a teacher, janitor, farmer, storekeeper, or something else. There's really a high feeling of equity in the community. And I think Fall Line's very mission driven. We have peers and colleagues from a lot of different organizations that are very mission driven, often driven by singular environmental goal or singular social goal or something else. I think that the way that people have equity in their businesses and the communities is often lost in the picture. We measure our impact at Fall Line across the classic ESG measurements. It's our intention to be leaders in this area. I think we also have a team that has a lot of sensitivity to the communities we operate in, and is much more sensitive to side effects of the businesses and our own actions than I think what we generally see. That's reflected in, I think, the way that we work with our farmers, that we tend to work with more mid-sized farmers and really helping them maintain an operation where maybe they wouldn't otherwise. There's a lot of different great vendors that we work with in our neighborhoods that are electricians and irrigation specialists and people who work in earthworks, all kinds of different things. And a single project may work, maybe 15 different families we're working with. Yeah. And really having an understanding of how that all fits together in that community is pretty important. It's a part of our history, a part of our future.
And what do you feel like has led to the loss of that feeling of ownership and equity? Maybe different cultures or...
Yeah, that's actually a pretty complicated topic, because I think it involves everything from antitrust law to the way that certain technologies have been implemented in very specific ways. For sure, there is a major long-term trend of consolidation of businesses in the world. Yeah. And we just don't have the kind of family-owned businesses that I grew up in, and that are still pretty common in grain farming. Yeah. The segment of agriculture where we're most active is the segment that happens to have that. Most of the advantages that the larger farmers have aren't actual resource use efficiency gains, it's pricing power. That makes it more pleasurable for us too.
Yeah. I think this brings me to the next question, that how would you describe personal flourishing? What does it mean to you to live like a fulfilling and meaningful life, and does it entail working on things that you have more ownership and agency and equity in, and things like that?
I think it's hard that's a pretty big question. I think it's hard to cover all of it, but I would say that originality and creativity and logic are all a big part of that, and that originates from kind of a lot of the direct observation that I was talking about. It's not getting ideas from reading something elsewhere or talking to somebody. We certainly want to integrate all of that.
Yeah.
But I want to develop ideas that aren't only an amalgamation of what I'm hearing and reading, but bringing in really fresh observations. Yeah, that's where a lot of the joy comes from.
Yeah, I love that, because I think, for one, I think even just getting to interact with Fall Line and with the farmers, that was one of my big realizations, was we live in so many abstractions away from the food that we consume, and yet the folks that are farmers, you're on the ground and you're literally right there and you're directly observing these things. And I think that can apply to so many other things in life, where it's like we can all operate at multiple abstractions away from reality, and that takes us away from, I think, really interesting and creative ideas. So I love that.
I guess this brings me to the last few questions. What advice would you give to young innovators and entrepreneurs who are passionate about making this sort of impact on the world?
So some of the advice that I would give to other builders and creative people is to be generous with your time in your community, and it will come back to reward you. In my early farming career, as I became known among other farmers and journalists and academics and a wide range of people in the industry and outside the industry, I would always take phone calls. I would always accept offers to go talk, even though there was no clear benefit for me. But it kept open doors, and people would share with me their ideas.
Podcasts.
Yes, yeah. And people can be overprotective of their ideas, their IP. Sharing is really what's gotten me ahead and helped me get to where I am today.
Yeah. I had heard you on another podcast, actually, you had mentioned the idea of forgetting yourself in your work. I really love that idea. Could you expand on that a bit as well?
This is very characteristic of the experience that I had working with my dad, and something I would observe very much in my grandparents and my parents, that the experience where somebody bumps their head or they cut their hand, and there's this kind of surge of self-awareness and wanting attention for yourself. Like that wouldn't be there. Like they're so focused on what they're doing that they wouldn't even notice.
Yeah.
And it's so outward.
Yeah.
And that's where kind of the sharing and the joint experience comes from. If you're working with people who are constantly have these instincts, self and ego and their own perspective, there's less to share. And it's those moments where we're all working together and it's all connected through what we're trying to do, the thing that we're building or the crop that we're harvesting or planting. Those are the best experiences.
And that's what I feel like I'm hearing from even this conversation, where if everyone's united in terms of relying on what these greatest problems are for our communities, we're generous with our time and our ideas, the more we can then share and then tackling these problems together as a community as well.
Last question. Are there any qualities or mindsets you believe that are essential for success in this field, in agriculture, venture capital?
I think
we touched upon
it's a great question. In venture, folks who raise money in startups, often you're trying to show how disruptive something can do. It's all about the upside. And all the little details that can make it fail are things that generally get lost in, you don't want to have in the pitch. But in actually operating a business, it's sweating the details that matter. It's what's the little thing that can make everything else break down. And in a world with a more complex supply chain, more complex tools, where you've got demands on reliability are much higher because you've got so many components in series, it's actually not just orthogonal, but opposed to what you need to do to actually be successful. At the same time, on the flip side, people who are typically 100% focused on sweating the details in a business that's driven by short-term cash flows never think about enterprise value. And like, where is my enterprise value? What is the upside to this enterprise? And working in farmland and working in venture, we're in the most kind of risk tolerant and the least risk tolerant assets that you can possibly be in. And I think that we bring the strengths to both. But I think it's something that anybody can do. And there's things to be gained if you're an operator, but can think more about enterprise value. And in venture, not getting so caught up in
just
the froth of the story that you lose the details.
Yeah, and I guess that's what the advantage that you have with Fallen is, that you have that access to both the operators and also the technology and venture side of things. For folks in the audience that want to keep up with you or with Fall Line, what's the best way to stay in touch or stay up to date?
Yeah, our website is www.fall-line-cap.com. That's probably the best place to start.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Clay. I really appreciate diving into all of this, and I think lots of folks will take a lot away from this.
Thanks, Melody.